Music theory. Why a mode-based chord naming system is objectively better. Noting that the objectively better here is large, red, and emboldened to pull attention to the fact that it's objectively better than the traditional scale degree chord naming system currently in place. All right, what's the objective here? Present a case for replacing the traditional chord naming system with a mode-centered approach. Now, obviously, I don't think we can completely do away with the current naming conventions, but I would propose that you would like to learn a system that's more intuitive, that makes it easier to jot things down and be able to then code switch or bridge over to the current naming convention, something way easier to do these days because we have things like ChatGTP, where you could just basically plug in your system into ChatGTP and say, just convert it, which it can do way more easily than converting like a language, because music is completely logical if you have a system that makes any sense. And if your system don't make sense, that doesn't make sense, because it should make sense because it's completely logical. Okay, so thesis. The mode-based system offers greater accuracy, logic, and spatial awareness for guitarists and other musicians. So in particular, the guitar fretboard, which is mimicked here with the low or heavy E string, the one closest to the ceiling on top, is completely symmetrical, unlike the piano. So I will say that these concepts I do believe would be a better way to envision even the piano. I say even the piano because the piano is not completely symmetrical. So you might have some memorization techniques to try to memorize your fingering as you go through the 12 different positions for the 12 different scales. But the guitar is totally symmetrical. So our goal on the guitar is to take advantage of that. We want everything to be shiftable. Everything should be shiftable. If it's not, and it could be, then you should fix it. You should do it better. My theory is always going to be, is there an easier way to do it? Is there an easier way to learn something than has historically been built up? If there is, the question is, would it be worth my time to learn it the easier way, which would be faster, and then bridge the gap to communicate with others? Or would it be better to try to learn it the more complex way? Most of the time, you would be better off you're taking the eagle's pass, how the crow flies, right? You want the shortest distance to get to your goal, which is to be able to navigate the fretboard, and then bridge the gap for basically communication, or try to bridge that gap as you are learning. That I think you'll advance way faster. So here's our analogy of the fretboard. We're going to say the fretboard is the map of the territory. And there's going to be 7 actually destination locations on it. Notice that there's 12 actual locations, but we're going to say the non-destination locations are like the oceans in the globe. We go through them, we're going to touch in on them, but that's not where we want to land, because we're human beings and we need land to land on. So for example, down here we have our, what I would call position number 1. And let's just lay out the continents as though it's the globe. So I'm just going to lay it out here. So this is, the 6 is going to be North America. And then over here we have Europe is going to be is the 7. And then Asia we'll have as the 1. We have South America is going to be the 2. Africa the 3. And then Australia the 4. And finally Antarctica the 5. So there's our continents. Now you can see the continents repeat. So we have to basically see the pattern is repeating. But the continents are always the same. So now the continents will change perspective if we're looking at it from, say, space, which is equivalent to us, our head, over the top of the guitar. Our head's up here looking over the top of the guitar, and we can visualize the guitar shifting around in a similar way as the world rotating around, imagining it has 12 different vantage points from our perspective up top over the guitar. We name those by the 12 different notes. So if I say that I'm in note 4 position or the C major position, then the whole shape is going to be looking like this. If I was in C sharp, then the whole thing would rotate. The planet would be rotating to the right, and it would be over here. Now, how would we want to visualize the guitar once we've determined the 12 different viewpoints, if I determined that I'm going to look at it from the viewpoint of the C, then I no longer want to look at it by note names. I want to look at it by the thing that doesn't change, the continent names, which could be the Nashville number system, 1 through 7, which is basically the same thing as saying that you're looking at it by mode, Ionian, Phrygian, Mixolydian, and so on. Why? Because those are the continents that don't change. So those will always be the same, and I want to look at basically those relationships. Why don't we do that? Well, historically, it didn't get built up that way because they were using the 7 notes on basically a piano, and then the piano jammed in the other sharps and flats, and it kind of built from there. The naming construction kind of built from there. And so the guitar is completely symmetrical, and if we rethink it to the most optimal way, this is the most optimal way. Now, there's another problem, that the naming convention that was put in place because of the historical building of the music theory has implications in it that pulls us out from the most logical way to view the guitar. That happens when we talk about distance, interval distance. It also happens when we talk about the chord names. So it's okay to use the chord names, but what we'd like to do is get a better understanding from a spatial center perspective on the guitar. That'll help us better visualize the guitar. It'll also help us better to jot down our ideas, which is the point of like tablature or sheet music or something like that, which we can do much more easily within the context of a song, and being able to map out visually, be able to visually memorize or see what you're doing if you use a modal-centered system. All right, that's the idea. So what's the historical context here? The traditional chord naming system is rooted in the major scale. Now remember, the general idea is like before, Western music kind of took off, I think most people were actually using possibly 5-note scale degrees, and maybe playing more in a Mixolydian mode than in the major and minor keys. But then the major and minor keys became popular. The 7 notes became something that was learned before the 12 notes. That's why the piano kind of looks at the natural 7 notes and then expands to the 12. And the major key was the thing that people liked to play at that time over anything else. So notice what happened then. They actually replaced the modes. The Greeks came up with 7 modes, right, which makes sense. But then we basically said, hey, we only like the one mode, which is the Ionian mode, and we're not even going to use the Greek name. We're just going to now call it a major scale. So the major scale, you can see that really, again, the naming convention makes us think and feel that that major scale is the thing that basically everything else is built from. Now, from a conventional standpoint, you can build everything. That is going to be our Rosetta Stone to build everything out. But we don't want to visualize that that is the only mode, because today people play in different modes. Minor mode for sure, minor scale, but also the Dorian and the Mixolydian are quite common, and we'd like to mix in the other ones as well, particularly from chord creation. So all chords are compared against the Ionian or major scale as a reference point. So again, the Ionian mode was renamed kind of to the major scale because that's the thing, that was the scale, right? It's like the king of scales, right? In that time frame. And then we basically measured all other modes to it. Now, when you build chords, there's a couple ways you can do it. One, you can visualize the chord on the fretboard or on your instrument. 2, you can build it by formula. And 3, you can build it by scale degrees or distances from the root. So when we look at the distances from the root, we often compare it to the major key. We say, here's the distances for the major, and then we compare all other chords or scale degrees to that. So, but again, that's artificial because all the modes are actually put together kind of like a fractal picture. So to say that the major scale is somehow separate or the thing that creates all other scales is kind of like from a physics standpoint saying that the world is like in a special location when you're trying to measure different things. It's all relative. It's just that we happen to be here. If you want to get the proper measurements, you got to think about the perspective. It's more like a fractal situation with the modes. They are all, combined together. You can derive any one of them from the other one. So although we want to use the major scale as our Rosetta Stone, you don't want to think of it as like it's different than all the other scales, like it's not intertwined. It's not completely entwined with all the other scales. So minor scales and other modes are treated as derivations, leading to a mismatch between theory and practical fretboard use. So the blues and jazz players inserted Mixolydian style 7 chords into the system by brute force, naming them as dominant sevenths. So people weren't really playing the Mixolydian mode during the kind of classical time frame because they were mainly playing the major, and then they kind of tacked on the minor. And again, you can just look at the names. The major makes you feel like that is the king of the king scale. It's not even a mode. It's been risen above modes. And then the minor is subordinate to the major, and everything else is basically kind of ignored. Now, again, that's probably not the way you want to see it these days, because you'd like to be able to see that they're all intertwined oftentimes. So that also led to chord construction where they didn't really have proper chord names for things that were built off of different chords, like the Mixolydian, which is quite common for bluesy kind of stuff, has a really kind of jammy feel, maybe not as much for an opera where you're trying to tell a story with it, but when you're just trying to groove, obviously it works quite well. So the blues guys came in and said, hey, we need to force into the naming construction the 7 chords, because the 7 in a Mixolydian has a minor 7. So we'll talk about the intervals later. There was no way to do that. So they forced a whole nother naming convention of the 7 chords. Why don't they just call it Mixolydian? That would have been the easy thing to do. That would be the logical thing to do. These are Mixolydian chords. But they don't want to do that because we have to keep with the same convention, the saying that the major's not really a mode and the minor's not really a mode. So the Mixolydian, we can't refer to the fact that the whole chord set is actually based on the Mixolydian mode. We have to call it something other than that. So they came up with 7 chords. So that's cool, all right? So this results in cluttered naming convention that lacks room for modal nuance. So we end up with a system that kind of covers all the bases. We can name all the different variations of the chords and possibly have a single name for each of them, which is kind of nice. But they don't give us any contextual understanding. They seem to be removed from where they're actually played within the song, and they don't give us any context of where they are on the fretboard, location-wise, or on any instrument. So let me just give you a quick idea of the buckets. We'll go into the normal naming convention later and try to get into the nuances of it. Right now, I just want to say a general idea of why there's a problem with it and why looking at it from a modal-based system is intuitive and an easier thing to do, and something that I would say is something you want to do as a precursor or at the same time that you're learning chords, because again, it'll help you break this false idea of the natural notes are the dominant notes and the Ionian is really the major scale and it's the king of scales, and then you have the subordinate minor, and then all the other modes are not even worth talking about, right? We need to break that mentality, because it's probably not the way you want to think of things in a modern musical sense. So we have the major. So remember, we have the major, and we build a triad when we build basically chords. So everything was based on the major. So you can build the chords 3 ways. You can think of it, visualize it on the fretboard. You can visualize the shape, or you can visualize, you can use the formula, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. Or you can build it by intervals, meaning you look at the root, whatever the root is, and you look at the distances from the root. We'll talk more about intervals later. And then they added the minor. So now the minor is something that became fairly popular. So now we're going to say the minor chords are going to be the ones that have a minor third related to them. Now, why are these 2 naming conventions not optimal? Notice that if you say something is the major and you're playing something in the key of C, there's going to be 3 different major chords you can build off of, which is going to be the Ionian, the 1, 4, 5, the Ionian, the Mixolydian, and the Lydian. But if I call them all major triads, it leads me to believe that I'm actually shifting the entire shape up, which isn't exactly correct. So it kind of leads to a mismatch of where it lines up on the fretboard, and it doesn't allow you to expand to things like adding the 6, the 7, the 9, and the 11 to them. Similarly, the minor bucket, if there's going to be 3 different minor chords in a normal scale. So if I'm in the key of C major or A minor, then you've got the Aeolian chord, you've got the Dorian, and you've got the Phrygian. But you're going to name the triads all minor triads. That doesn't give you any visualization of where it's actually located on the fretboard, right? And so that it's not the, and plus, again, if you add the 7, 9, 11, and 13, it won't be the same. And so again, you can't really tell by the normal naming construction whether the chord fits diatonically. It has the same 7 notes, or if it's outside the key somehow. I'd like a chord system that tells me if it's diatonically in the key or not. And you can easily do that by just recognizing that modes exist. Then you've got the dominant. These are basically the 7 chords, the bluesy chords, where they kind of said, hey, look, the Mixolydian mode doesn't fit into the major and minor system at all. So why didn't they just call it a Mixolydian mode? Well, they couldn't call it a Mixolydian mode because, again, they're trying to pretend modes don't exist. People are scared of modes. I think this is a conspiracy. The modes are actually easier, not more difficult. It would be easier to learn the modes, okay? And so they made it a 7 chord, and that's going to be the entire bucket for basically the blues chords based off the Mixolydian. And then you've got the diminished. So the diminished, again, the Locrian mode doesn't fit in any of them. Now again, people don't play in Locrian, but you do build chords off the Locrian, so you need to be able to name the chords. So they made another bucket called diminished, which again isn't exactly based on the major scale, which is normally what it is, but they kind of based it off the minor. But then it still didn't work for the Locrian, so they created a half diminished, which, like with the dominants, like with the 7 chords, they might as well have called the half diminished chords the Locrian intervals. They basically had to just make up another thing and say this is they could have just called it these are the Locrian intervals, right? But they didn't. But we want to pretend like modes don't exist, so they called them half diminished. Okay, so it doesn't really give us any context, and it's kind of an intimidating term. Half diminished is kind of intimidating. So, and then you also have augmented and suspended, which could help us to make more complex chords that are outside the diatonic key. So again, we'll get into these chord constructions later, but I just want to just kind of note the arbitrariness here, right? We started with the major, and then we tacked on the minor, and then they kind of made a whole nother bucket for the Mixolydian mode and called it the dominant or 7 chord. And then we had to make these 2 other buckets to basically encapsulate the Locrian mode. And then we have the augmented, which could help us to pick up anything that doesn't fit in the key. So it would be a lot easier if we just recognized the modes, and it would give us more modal context. All right, so let me get an idea of this. If we're in the key of C, notice that the Nashville number system would basically say, look, we're going to be playing the 1, 4, 5. The 1, 4, 5. Now, most people would say those are 3 major chords. The 1, 4, 5 in the key of C. And that's true. It's going to have a triad. It's going to have basically the same shape. But you can see the shape around the chord is not the same. If I look at this shape around it, here versus around here, for example, it's not the same shape. They're in different locations on the fretboard. And also, we're playing off of different notes. So again, most people would say that's a C major, and then you go into an F major, and then a G major. But that's not as useful, because then if I was playing in C sharp, in the key of C sharp, then I would have all different notes. I would have 3 different majors based on the note name. I'd rather name them by continent, the equivalent of continents here, and which could be the Nashville number system, or you use the modes, and that tells me where the location is within the larger shape. So if you don't do that, what's going to happen, you're going to get confused and say, look, that when I go from this major chord to this major chord, I shifted the whole shape back over here. But that's not normally what happens, because you're playing something that's in the same diatonic key. So what you want to envision when someone says we're playing the 1, 4, 5 is that all the 1, 4, 5 are in the same key, and you're going to 3 different triads which build a major triad, meaning they have a major third from the root, but they're actually going from the 1, which is the Ionian, the 4, which is the Lydian, and the 5, which is the Mixolydian. That helps you to visualize the actual shape on the guitar. And so you might say, well, then I have to learn 3 things instead of just 1 thing. Not really, because you know that the triad shape is the same. If you're playing the guitar, the triad shape for the 1, 4, 5 is the same. Just remember that the 4 and the 5 are not the same location, right? The 4 and the 5 have a different overarching shape. They're in a different spot on the fretboard. So I don't even really think it takes any more memorization, and it's going to really open up the fretboard, as they say, because you'll be able to expand and be able to realize that this is a different shape that you're building off of. You're not moving the whole shape over here. You're building you're building within the same overarching shape. So that's going to be, the general idea. So that means that when we build the chords, it would be easier to basically name them by the Nashville number system or the absolute modes rather than the note names. Now, the other problem is that what if I was playing in the key of A minor? So it has all the same notes, but now it's in the key of A minor. From a scale degree system, what would happen? They would name this not the 6 anymore, but the 1. The Nashville number system is is marketed kind of like a shortcut to say, look, we're not going to do that. We're going to play as though we're in the key of C, the related major, and keep that as the 6, which sounds like a shortcut, but it's not actually a shortcut. That's the logical thing to do. It would be easier to do that because, look, I want to keep that as the 6, and I want to recognize that if I play all of the minors, which is going to be the Aeolian, the Dorian, and the Phrygian, I don't want to rename it to the 1, 4, 5 in the key of A minor. I want to recognize that I'm in the key of A minor, but keep the numbers as it's note number 6. It's the location number 6, 2, and 4, or 6, 2, and 3. Why? Because that's the same numbering system. I already know the numbers because I know that those are going to be the minor chords. Because if you memorize the chord constructions based on the major key, the 1, 4, 5 are major, and the 2, 3, and 6 are minor. So why would I then go to the minor key and have to memorize that now the 1, 4, 5 in the minor key is now the minors, when I could just keep the numbers the same and say I'm playing around the 6. So I want to play the 6, 2, 3. If I want to play all the minors, I'm going to play the 6, 2, 3. And the tonic will be the A as the tonic. You see, that's way more intuitive. You're gonna open up and visualize the fretboard a lot faster using that logic than you would changing the number system all the time. All right, limitations of the current system. Treats major scale as the primary reference, forcing reinterpretation of all other modes. So we're basically saying, here's the major key, and then we're going to change the major key or reference every other key to the major key, which could have its uses when you're looking at interval relationships. But if you're renaming the scale degrees, that becomes a problem. So it requires consistent renaming of scale degrees. So again, Nashville number system is right. That's the more sophisticated system. So there's a reason it came up. It's not like people are stupid and they're like, hey, I don't know the numbers when you change it to a Dorian. So, well, look, what we'll do is we'll just keep the numbers the same as though you're in the related major. Yeah, why don't we do that all the time? Because that makes sense. That makes more sense, right? There's a reason the shortcut happened. It's because the current system is more bureaucratically bloated than it needs to be. The shortcut is the eagle's path, flying as the crow flies, and the current system is going around the mountain, and when you don't need to. So misrepresents the diatonic system by making players think they are changing keys when shifting modes. So most people learn the major number system, and then they remember that the 1, 4, 5 is major, the 2, 3, and 6 is minor, and the 7 is Locrian. But if you don't know the nuances that the 1, 4, 5 are actually different on the guitar, then it's going to lead you to think that you're shifting the major shape every time. The scale degree forces you to do that too, because to build a chord, you have to say it's the 1, 3, 5. The naming convention of a 1, 3, 5 forces you to think of the root as the 1 when you don't want to change it to the 1. If I'm building the root off of the 6, the Aeolian, I want to keep it as the 6. I don't want to call it a 1, 4, 5 because now you're making me call it a 1. See that whole system is gonna walk out your whole naming convention, which is gonna really mess you up when you're trying to learn all the locations in the most optimal way. So it creates redundancy and confusion when intervals and chord types. So you got like a minor 7 and a dominant 7 and so on, which again would be the name is not as clean as it could be. It lacks clarity on where you are within the single shared diatonic scale. So once again, it would be a lot easier to name the chords instead of saying I'm going to the 1, 4, 5 and think of them as 3 major chords, to be saying that you're going to the 1, 4, 5 and see them as different locations. The 1 is the Ionian, the 4 is the Lydian, the 5 is the Mixolydian, which will make more sense because on the 5, for example, if I add the 7 to it, it's going to be a different shape than over here, because again the Mixolydian is different once you start adding more than just the triad locations. If I play in the minor key, the related minor to the C major, same shape, I don't want to call the A the 1. If I play all the minors and the root being the 6, I want to call it the 6, 2, 3. That's going to be a lot easier to not change the continent. Don't change the continent names, keep them the same. So the mode-based alternative. So each chord is built from a modal center. So we have the Ionian, the Dorian, the Phrygian, the Lydian, the Mixolydian, Aeolian, Locrian. Now there's conspiracy theories out there. People are trying to scare us to say that the modes are too intimidating, so they don't want to learn. They're too confusing. But again, it's more intuitive to use the modes. The Nashville number system, which is supposed to be a shortcut hack, is basically using modes. It's just changing the name to a number, which is fine, but to really master that system, you want to realize that the number is different. The 1 is different from the 4, is different from the 5. It has the same shape if you look at a triad, but it's a different location on the guitar, and if you go beyond the 3-note chord, it will be different. So I think it would be well worth your time to learn the modes, and then I'm going to give an abbreviation of the modes because these are the continents on your guitar that don't change. That's what you want to memorize. So an example, we could build a chord construction something like this. We could say it's a DD3. What does that stand for? It's a Dorian. That's what this D stands for. And that's the mode. The root is a D, so it's a D Dorian. And it's a 3 modal whole steps. So it means it's a 4-note chord. So again, this looks kind of messy, but it's actually cleaner oftentimes than much of the systems that we currently have. And the construction of it is really easy. So because you just take every other note. So in other words, I'm on the Dorian. The Dorian is usually the 2 from our Nashville number system. So I'm not going to rename it as the 1 when I build my chord. So instead of saying it's a 4-note chord and I have to say it's going to be the 1, the 3, the 5, and the 7, I'm just going to say, no, look, I'm just going to start on the Dorian, right? I'm going to start on the Dorian, which is I'll keep as the 2, and then I'm going to go up 3, what I call modal whole steps, meaning I'm just going to skip every other note. That's how we build chords. We'll get into this more detail when we actually map this out in Excel, but you just skip every other note, right? So you just go we're going to skip every other note, and we build up our chord. And so it's actually a 4-note chord. The reason I have a 3 there is because that's the distance. It's a distance term, meaning you're going to start on this node, and then you're going to skip every other note that is in the scale, every other mode, every other node, every other Nashville number system. That's the most intuitive way to build it. Now remember, there are 3 ways that we can build the chord. We can kind of visualize it on the guitar by shape. We can use the holes, and we can use the formula to build a chord, and we can also use intervals. So you might say, look, I don't know the intervals of the Dorian. And that's fair enough, but you do know intuitively that you just pick every other note of the 7 notes that you're playing in. So that would be the easy kind of way to build it. And most people possibly don't really know the intervals that well for the major as well. They mostly know the shapes. So it would be great to learn the intervals, and you could learn the intervals for all the different chords as well, and that would be a good thing to do. But even if you don't know the intervals, this would be way more intuitive to do by shape it would be way more intuitive to do if you just build it by taking every other note. I just know it's a 4-note chord, a 4-note Dorian chord. I'm just going to start on the 2, and I'm just going to skip every other note. It also tells me where I am on the guitar. It gets me more reference point on the guitar. Now, you might say no one else does that. That's fine, but I think it would still be easier for you to do to write down your ideas, because it gives you the context of the song. It gives you more ability to see what you're trying to do. And then if you want to communicate it to other people that don't know that system, you can convert it easy, because ChatGTP can just make the conversion. You could just say, hey, look, ChatGTP, here's the system that I'm using. Convert it to to whatever normal chords that you have, allowing you to write your music, write down your ideas, and the way that makes most intuitive sense to you, gives you the best visualization of the fretboard, and then convert them if you need to. You can also go the other way. If someone gives you something, you might say, look, this is a mess. ChatGTP, convert it to this modal system, and it can do it, and will most likely make it a lot easier for you to visualize what's actually happening within the song. So modal steps represent consistent structures across the fretboard. So a DD3 would represent a Dorian chord built on the tonal center. So in other words, if we used a system like this and say, hey, look, this is the D chord, we have the ability to make a lowercase or uppercase. So I could also make it say it's a capital D for a capital Dorian to indicate that that's the tonal center, that's the home base. So that gives us more flexibility too than what we currently have. Like when you say something, when you're playing in the current system, there's no real way to indicate that it's the tonal center with a capital letter, which you could do if you use this kind of format. So that's kind of a cool little thing as well. So that would be the general idea. We can locate where we are on the fretboard and say, here's the Dorian right here. So if I'm building a chord off of the Dorian, then I can skip every other note from the Dorian to build the chord. So all I need to know is how many notes are in the chord and what node we are starting on. That will help me to basically just construct the chord. So we'll get into intervals. We could build it by interval or build it by shape as well. We'll talk about that later. We could also just know that, of course, the Dorian is the 2, and therefore it's a minor chord. So if it was a triad, it would have a minor chord. If we go beyond the triad, we're going to have to know when the Dorian is different than the minor chord, when it's different than the Aeolian, right? Because that's when the shape is going to be different from the Dorian, and that could get into intervals or more complex shape learning, but there's no way around learning that. And if you learn the modal system, you will realize that you need to learn that, right? If you just learn that this Dorian is the same as a minor chord, then you're not going to understand that that you're actually in a different shape. You're not going to understand that it's going to have an interval that's different than the major or when that comes up. So even if you don't know what that interval is, it's better to say, it's like learning a shortcut to math that doesn't iterate forward. I've learned a shortcut that only works under these very isolated conditions, but once I expand the window, the shortcut not only doesn't work, but acts as a barrier for me to understand the true nature of what is happening here. That's what happens here if you see the Dorian and you make it the 1, and you see it then as a major, even though it's as a minor chord, even though it's a Dorian, right? It leads you to misread where you are on the fretboard and what the shape looks like in its full extension, restricting you from building more complex chords. Advantages for guitarists. So mirrors how modes appear as fixed patterns on the fretboard. So if you're cutting up the fretboard, which is normal to do, you're going to use basically a 5 positions on the fretboard to cut the fretboard up and memorize the locations that you can name 1 through 5. You might be using a 3-note per string thing to basically be building out the scales on the fretboard, and so on and so forth. As you do that, you can see that the modes will fit into that, right? You can kind of name your positions by modal positions. Some ways that you break out the fretboard, you could name them, by basically the modal position instead of just a scale position. So you want to be able to see the fretboard from, the different perspectives, and modes is clearly going to be one of those perspectives, which the current chord naming convention doesn't help you to intuit out and should. Prevents mental gymnastics for converting everything back to a major scale equivalent. So we shouldn't be having to like look at all the modes and convert the intervals and so on back to a major for comparison. We would like to learn the modes themselves, and also we shouldn't have to be basically renumbering all of our chord systems on a scale degree basis in order to build the chords. That's mental gymnastics that you don't need. You can remove it by not doing that, not renaming the numbering system on a scale degree basis. Allows thinking in terms of consistent node locations rather than temporary key centers. So learning all the notes on the guitar, that's a good goal to have. But is it the thing that's going to open up the fretboard the fastest and in the most utilitarian way? No, it's not, because you learn all the notes on the fretboard, but you don't know which notes are on the 7 destination continents. How do you know the 7 destination continents? You learn them by location names, by the Nashville number system, by the actual the nodes in the system. Those are the ones that are going to allow you to maneuver around. So it helps players understand the D Dorian and an E Phrygian are part of the same C major scale. So again, when you're looking at any set of notes, we usually name them based on the major key. So, but remember that those 7 notes, the major key is not any better than the other notes. That's just the way that's just the Rosetta Stone to name the 7 keys. I can use a center point of the 6 of it, meaning that would be a minor chord, right? A minor scale if we played it in order from that point. But I don't want to rename it. I don't want to renumber it from the 6. I want to recognize that it's the same collection of notes. I think the more old terminology was that we have a collection of notes, and then a scale is when you play those collection of notes in order. Currently, we typically think of a scale as basically we have the collection of notes and we're playing around the center point, right? Unless we're saying we're playing the actual scale, right? We're playing in a scale, that's the center point, and so on. But the old terminology is a little bit better. We're naming the collection of notes based on the major scale. It would be better to name the collection of notes, the 7 notes based on the major scale, and then say where the modal center is. So I'm going on the collection of notes for the C major. Those give me the 7 notes, but my center point, my home base, my tonic is the 6 or Aeolian. So you could say I'm playing in A minor that way, but that would indicate that you're going to renumber the system. I don't want to renumber the system. I want to say I'm playing in the collection of notes related to the major, because that's the way most people can visualize the shape the easiest. But the center point, the tonic, is the 6 or the Aeolian. Anyway, encourages viewing modal movements as shifts within a single grid rather than key modulations. So that's going to be a key component, because like I say, if you're playing in the Aeolian here, I don't want to rename the 6 to the 1, right? I want to see it in the same place. And if I go from the 6, to the 2, I want to see that as not going from a minor to a minor chord, a minor chord to a minor chord. I want to see it as going from the Aeolian to the Dorian, from the 6 to the 2. Those are both minor triads, but they're actually different shapes. Structural clarity with the modal whole steps. So chords are rooted as steps away from the modal root. So the normal scale degree system forces us once again, if I want to build a minor chord off of this 6, I have to make that the 1 and then pick every other note. So it would be the 1, 3, 5 based off of this as the 1. I don't want to do that. I want to keep that as the 6. Now this is where the measuring system, the analogy is, you have a kid that's standing 3 feet tall, the basketball hoop is 10 feet tall, you're trying to measure from the top of the kid to the basketball hoop, and you count the kid's head as foot number 1 and say that the top is the 8th foot away, right? No, the kid is 3 feet tall, and from the top of his head, it's 7 feet away. I don't need to rename the 6 to the 1 to measure the head of the kid, right? The head of the kid could still be the head of the kid. It's 6. And then I measure the distance. The distance could be measured in the 7-note series from that step, which would be there's 2 modal whole steps up, meaning I skip every other note. So I skip every other note, doom, boom, to build the chord. So that means that would be the proper way to measure something rather than the scale degree system. You end up with something, the scale degree system is all off by 1 from my perspective. So you could say, how do you build a chord, a 3-note triad? They usually say it's the 1-3-5. But no, I'd rather say it's on the node you're on, and then we go up 2 modal whole steps every other node, and then we go up another 2 modal whole steps, right? So the C would be skipping this one to here to here. You skip every other note on the 7 notes, right? If the C would skip every other note here to here. So the C major would better be named, by the way, by naming the nodes, Ionian, Phrygian, Mixolydian. And again, how cool is that? That would be so much better to name it. Now, remember, if you're saying something is, let's say you're a minor, right? It's a minor and we're in A minor. Wouldn't it be a lot nicer to say, instead of saying the A minor has an A, skip every other note, to a C, to an E, to say that, no, let's just say that we're looking at the 3-note chord that's based off of the Aeolian or the minor. What would that include? It would include the notes, the nodes, the continents that we would be holding down of Aeolian or the 6, the Ionian or the 1, and then the Phrygian, right? And why is that better? Because it's universal. It's movable, right? That means that if I move the whole shape up so that I'm not playing in A minor, but I'm playing in B minor, then I'd have to learn all new notes if I look at it by note. But the continents will remain the same. You should be naming it by, look, it's still got the Aeolian, Ionian, and Phrygian. Why would you? That's the easiest way to name it, and it's totally maneuverable. Now, again, one reason this might not happen is because it's not totally maneuverable on the piano. The piano's different because the black keys are not symmetrical. So it might be helpful on the piano to name the notes, because when you shift up through the 12 different keys, there's a different fingering because it's not a symmetrical instrument. I still think this system would be better for the piano even, but on the guitar, it's clearly better. It's totally symmetrical. You shouldn't be like, why would I, once I've located where the collection of notes are, I don't want to name the notes that are in the chord by relative scale degrees. I want to name them by absolute numbering system. And I don't want to name the notes by the note name. I want to name them by the Nashville numbered system, which is equivalent to naming them by the modes, because it's movable. If it's not movable on the guitar, you can move on with that system. If your system ain't movable on the guitar, you can move on with that. I don't care how it works on the piano. It's not right. And I still think it's not the best way even on the piano, but more consistent than the traditional scale degree intervals. So avoids the redefinition of the 1 degree depending on the context. So again, I don't want to make the 6 the 1. I want to measure from the 6, right? And so but I have to, because the 6, I have to measure the 1-3-5 from it. No, you don't have to measure the 1-3-5. You can keep it as the 6 and say that you're going a distance of 2 modal whole steps up from that, right? 2 modal half steps, and then 2 modal half steps, right? You're going up every other note from there. Boom, boom. That's the way to do it. And you can also convert to the scale degrees by saying the scale degrees are off by 1. So how would you measure it up? You measure it by saying you're going from the 0, the node you're on, up to 2 modal half steps, up another 2 modal half steps, which would be equivalent to, if you move that up 1, it's off by 1, the current system's off by 1, that would be equivalent to the 0 to 4 is equivalent to the 1-4-5, right? What, the 1-3-5. Anyway, I hope I got that right. So that's going to be the general idea. So summary, and so that's going to be the general idea. So summary. So the traditional system is a legacy-based and major scale centered. So again, I love the system. I love, the system works. It's logical. You can put it in the ChatGTP. It works. It's just not the cleanest. It's not the cleanest, and it's certainly not the cleanest system for the guitar, which is a symmetrical instrument. So it all makes logic sense. I'm not saying it doesn't like work. It works. It's just it's like writing computer code and you wrote like 5 pages of code when you could trim it down to like half a page. That's basically what's happening here. It works, but you're memorizing 5 pages of code to do it, and you only need to memorize like half a page if you wrote it a little bit more clean. And so I say, let's write it more clean and then convert it, translate it to the 5-page mode system so that we can then communicate with people that want you to jump through the hurdles. They want you to fill out the paperwork. Tell me everything about you. I don't care. Well, I'm just trying to play a song here. Well, tell us, who your spouse is and where you live, and give us this, your social. Look, I'm just trying to play a song here, right? That's what happened. I'm just trying to give my taxes. Okay, I know you're trying to give us your taxes, but tell us everything that's happened to you since your childhood, and then give us your money, right? No, like do it the easy way and then jump through the hoops when you have to. That's what I say. Any case. So a mode-centered naming system offers better spatial awareness, less ambiguity, logical and modular expansion, compatibility with modern tools like Excel and fretboard diagrams. So again, the funny thing is that all of the MIDI and the softwares are having to do this. They're having to clean up this messy system so that the computer can work, which is just hilarious. Because I think it's funny because like we're giving the computer how to do it the easy way, and we're still doing it the confusing way. The computer is there to make complex tasks easy, and what we're doing is we're dumbing down the task to the easy way so the computer can do it, so that we can reinterpret it in our mind the complicated way. That's backwards. No, we should we should do it the easy way, and then expand on the complexity based on our music, not based on the language that we created from the music that's all messy, and then use the computer to trim down and do cool stuff. From that point, we can build a lot further if we had a cleaner system. So this approach doesn't just fix inconsistencies; it sets up a better foundation for improvisation, composition, and education. So again, I really think that if you jot your stuff down like this, you will better understand what you're doing, right? It'll give you a better context of the feel of the song that you're kind of trying to put together, because it's giving you more context from a musical based system, whereas the current chords don't tell you anything about the current song you're in. They're not telling you which chord, like where you are on the fretboard. They're not telling you which mode that you're basically in. So anyway, that's my idea. That's what I think.